Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13. Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13. We'll go into Jericho. Preston must be teaching class today. The songs that he picked are very fitting for the subject that we're singing, or not singing, but studying tonight. Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13. And so we sort of finished the first kind of section of Joshua a couple weeks ago when we met on Wednesday night, and where God was really preparing the people through Joshua in order to begin conquering the land. But in Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13, it begins a new section where they're done preparing and now they're doing it. They are going into battle, and at first they're having great success. And that's what we're going to look at tonight in Joshua chapter 5, starting in verse 13, is the battle of Jericho and how successful it was. But of course, it was successful in a way that, if I think if it was us and God had told us to do this and we know anything at all about battle, we're thinking, how would that be successful? Why would marching around a city 7 days make a difference? And so there's sort of an element here of, at times, God gives us instructions that to us, maybe we don't quite understand them. Sometimes people, I don't understand why God requires baptism. I don't understand why God chose to talk to us through the Bible and why he doesn't just talk to us in person. I don't understand, and sometimes the way God does things, or the path that he chooses for executing his will, or for bringing us to salvation, or whatever it might be, it doesn't quite match what we think things should be. It's kind of 1 Corinthians 1, Paul describes there's world wisdom, and then there's God's wisdom. And to the world, and really for us who have come out of the world, and who are in the world but not of it, and still influenced by the world, even being in the church sometimes, we're still struggling a little bit here and there to figure out, well, how does that work, and why does it work that way? But the question that Joshua asked is, even if we don't understand why or how, if we understand that is in fact what God is asking us, are we willing to do it without fully understanding all the hows or all of the whys? And in particular, I think you can think of it through the lens of an obstacle. And that's what Jericho is. It is a block in their path. It's an obstacle, and they must make it past this first obstacle if they're really going to go any further into the land. But it starts in chapter 5 and verse 13, and it says, "It came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him, and his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries?" Now, he sees this person here, and it's clearly a person of war, clearly a person who I think Joshua must have been somewhat intimidated by in order to ask this question, this sort of nervous question of, should I be drawing my sword, or are you here to help us out? And of course, this man that he sees has to me, it's kind of a funny answer. He just says, no. The answer to your question is no. I'm not for you in the way that Joshua was thinking about it. I'm not for your adversaries. He says, no, but as commander of the army of the Lord. That's the all caps Lord. That's Yahweh. That's the covenant name that Joshua knows belongs to his God. And so he says, I am the commander of the army of your army, of the army that's following you, of your God. And then he continues and says, I have now come. I have come as the commander. And so, sometimes I think that's what people do, right? We try to get God to see things from our perspective, or to do things in our way. And God's response really is no. How it is how it is. And there's sort of this, let's look at things from his perspective and from his way. Doesn't mean he doesn't care about us. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't pray to him about things. It doesn't mean that he isn't on our side. It just means that how things are is the right way. And we wouldn't want him to change things how we think they should be, because that would get everything out of whack. And so he says no, and calls himself the commander. And so Joshua, being the Moses, that's what the last section proved to us. He is the Moses of this generation. he's the leader of this army. And so there's an opportunity here for him to sort of rile up and say, "Now hold on." It says Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Now, it's interesting there because he worships him. And sometimes people in the Bible, they fall down and they worship angels. But what do angels always do? And don't do that. Right? Don't worship me. I can't be worshipped. I'm not God. Angels do not want to be worshipped because that would be wrong. And they're very clear about that. But this man, this commander, he doesn't tell Joshua to rise up. And so what does that tell us about the commander of the Lord's army? It must be the Lord. It's more than an angel. More than, it's what sometimes the Old Testament calls the angel of the Lord. It's what I believe to be Jesus before he was born. The second person of the Godhead on earth before he was human. And so you have God here himself coming, and Joshua recognizes this, and he worships him, just like Abraham would have worshipped God when he came to visit him in Genesis, just like Moses worshipped God. And in fact, we're going to see that tie in just a moment. There's a tie back to Moses, still sort of proving that Joshua is Moses for this generation. But he worships him immediately, without hesitation. Joshua is a very meek man. He knows his place. He is to lead the people, but he is not God, and he knows that. And so he says, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." Now, what is that supposed to remind us of specifically? The burning bush. Yeah, and so there's this tie back of this moment that Moses found the burning bush, and he drew near out of curiosity, and what is this? And it's God, and he says, "Take off your sandal." Recognize this is a special, if God is here, it must be special. Where God is a special place. God today is in the church. God today is among God's people. I was going to have to take our shoes off everywhere we go, but that He is among us, and so that's a special place for us to be because it is where God is. And so Joshua, it says at the end of verse 15, did so. Now I really sort of hate that that they made this a new chapter. I kind of understand why, because on the one hand, you have this last sort of big reference to Moses, and so you can kind of tie it back to the previous section and say, well, they're confirming Joshua's Moses. But what it does is, I think it pulls you out of the conversation with the commander and kind of puts you in, it makes you think that this is a new conversation. But notice what it says. It says in chapter 6 and verse 1, "Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None of them went out and none of them came in. And the Lord said to Joshua," and so really you have the same conversation here. The commander is the Lord, and there's Jericho. It's they're terrified, and then the Lord just picks up the conversation further. And for my own benefit, I even drew a little line here between verse 15 and chapter 6 and verse 2, and underline the word Lord to remind myself this is not a different conversation, or this is not a different person. I think is really the emphasis there. This is the same person having the same conversation. Joshua is talking to the commander of the Lord's army. He says, "What do you want me to do?" Now the Lord is going to answer that, answering the question back from verse 14. The Lord said to Jericho, verse 2, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all of you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. And then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man, straight before him." Now I think this is important because Joshua has asked the question, "What do you want me to do?" And the angel, or the commander of the Lord's army has told him, this is the exact details of what we're going to do for the next 7 days. And it's important because Joshua, I think, is recognizing something significant in this commander that was sent to him. And I imagine that, or in my experience, a lot of people, in the church recognize that this is the angel of the Lord, that this is God. But I've only just recently learned myself that he is himself a fulfillment of prophecy that God made. If you remember in Exodus chapter 34, if you turn with me to Exodus chapter 34, we didn't make it this far when we studied Exodus. Curriculum had us move on before we got here. But it's really a very fascinating section, and really we'll start in chapter 33, just a little bit back. But this is sort of the big moment of Exodus. All the book builds up to this moment where Moses sort of has this conflict, this difficulty, because the people are half-hearted in following God. And God says, I know that they're half-hearted. I know that they're not really all in. And so he says, if you go back to the beginning of chapter 33, he says, in verse 3, he says, "Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." And so God has been physically and visibly with them, but he says, I can't do that anymore. They're stiff-necked. They won't listen. I can't be that close to sinful people. And so I'm not going to be physically or visibly with you any longer. And the people and Moses are devastated. It says in verse 4, it says, "When the people heard this bad news, they mourned, and no one put on this ornament." And so the rest of the chapter and into chapter 34 is Moses pleading with God, "Please send someone with us. Please be with us where we can see you, where we can know that you are with us. Please stay close to us, God, in your mercy and in your grace." And then this is that part where he asks to see God's glory, and God says, "You can't handle that." And he says, "I'll show you the backside of my glory," and passes by Moses, and the rock covers his face when he goes by. And it's that section here. And so if you skip ahead to verse 13, chapter 33 and verse 13, it says, "Now therefore I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people." And so verse 14, God says, "Okay, my presence will go with you." And you're thinking, the big pillar of fire and cloud or something like that. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he goes on to describe his nature. And I think it's very significant. If you notice down in chapter 34, it says in verse 5, that the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sins, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children of the third and fourth generation. And so Moses made haste and bowed his head toward the earth, and he worshipped. And you notice that's just like what Joshua did back in Joshua chapter 5. He recognized this is that same person, that same God that Moses worshipped, and who made that promise that my presence will go before you, that I will be with you. And I've lost the verse reference here. I was trying to scan for it. There's a spot right in here somewhere that he makes it just a little bit more obvious, where he says, and I still, of course, I'm scanning fast and I can't find it. But in essence, he says, my angel will go before you. And so when you get to chapter 5, Joshua chapter 5, and verse 13 with this man, you have sort of this fulfillment. He says, when you get to the land, my angel will go before you. This is that angel, that deity coming in a physical form to command and to fulfill all that God had promised would be fulfilled. And so he gives them very specific instructions to go into the land. And really, it's kind of things that as we mentioned, don't exactly make sense from a human perspective, right? Marching around a city doesn't usually cause the walls to fall in on themselves. Blowing trumpets, no matter how many trumpets you have, and no matter how loud you blow them, big walls don't normally fall down and destroy cities when you do that. But these are the instructions. And so, before we move on to chapter 6 and verse 6, any thoughts or comments so far?
I just thought because it was not an angel or not an apostle,
Mm-hmm.
but saying commander, and their commander was capitalized, is that why you're saying it's God?
Well, not because it's capitalized so much. That's capitalization is a choice that the translators make, and so we always have to kind of ask, well, were they right in that? But I think they were this time because Joshua worships him, and only God accepts worship rightfully. You never see a righteous being if a human tries to worship him. Cornelius falls down before Peter, and Peter says, "I'm just a man. Please do not do that." Or and then often angels, people try to worship them, and they say, "Do not do that. I don't want the wrath of God because you worship me, and I accepted it like I'm God." So, for this man to accept Joshua's worship, and then to give Joshua specific instructions that Joshua fulfills and works, he must be God himself. Steve?
The transfiguration.
I'm sorry?
The transfiguration on the mountain.
Yes.
Moses and Elijah. It's very clear we are to only worship our Lord.
That's right.
And this is the same situation here.
Mm-hmm.
I like 2 and 14 there. Reminds me of Paul on the road to Damascus. He said, "Lord, what would you have me do?"
Right.
And he's offering up his submissiveness to what the Lord would have him do.
Sure.
And then that shows that he's willing.
That's right. Yeah. So Steve is talking about first the transfiguration of Jesus in the New Testament, and sort of the example that's laid out there that only God is to be worshipped. Nobody else is to be worshipped like Jesus and the Father and the Spirit are. But then he also mentioned, and I think it's a really good parallel, when Paul is on the road to Damascus and he's blinded and he hears this voice and he says, "Why are you kicking against the goads, Paul?" And Paul is convinced by this happening, and so his reply is, "Lord, what would you have me to do?" Just like Joshua says here. And so I'm sure that Paul has 1,000 questions because this goes against everything that he's believed very strongly. I'm sure that he has 1,000 questions, but in this moment, he's not having to have Jesus make a bullet point of every little thing to answer his questions. He understands that he needs to do what Jesus says, and so he says, "I'll do it, and we'll figure all this out on the way." Yes.
We looked at these things that you were talking about are odd for us to understand.
Sure.
And from the time they left Egypt to even right now, he is building a faith in these people.
That's right.
And it's not an easy thing to do. I thought about on the way here. I thought, where's my faith in the Lord?
Sure.
And that's really what he's doing to these people, walking around that city. What's that about?
Yes.
I can't even talk.
Can't even talk. Yes, sir.
Hey, we didn't have no women in that crowd.
Really, it's. I know he's teasing about that, but just for anybody, I think that's a hard command to obey. Is we're gonna walk around the city all day and not say anything. Yes, ma'am.
Is the transfiguration on the line of when Christ was ascended and he changed?
No, well, on the line of, there's sort of a parallel there, if that's what you're asking. Yes, ma'am. The transfiguration happens before his death, when he and Peter and Andrew and John go up on the mountain, and Jesus is seen talking to the spirits of Moses and Elijah. And that's when Peter says, "Well, let's build a tabernacle to all 3 of you." And the Father in the cloud interrupts him and says, No. They're not equal. You just build a tabernacle to Jesus. He's the only one that we should listen to. He's the only one we should worship. And so, yes, ma'am. All right, picking up then in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 6, it says, "Then Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, 'Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord.' And he said to the people, 'Proceed and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the ark of the Lord.' And so it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests to blow the trumpets, and the rear guard came up after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, 'You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word,'" this is Steve was talking about, "'nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day that I say to you, shout, and then you shall shout.' And so he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once, and then they came into the camp and lodged in the camp." And so, you think, you think of Jericho as sort of this obstacle that they have to get around. And a lot of times in life we face obstacles, difficulties, whether it's financial difficulties or difficulties concerning temptation or difficulties with relationships, and they feel like great obstacles, like a big city that you can march around, but you can't get into and you can't knock over, you can't remove, and rightfully so. We'll pray to God about it, and it's hard sometimes, isn't it, to wait for those answers. And you think they've marched around the city one time, and that's not the beginning of it. Some of these people were alive when they left Egypt. They were younger, they were 19 or younger, but they were alive when they left Egypt right at the beginning of all of this. They were slaves in Egypt, and they have watched all of these things happen, going through the Red Sea, at Mount Sinai, refusing to enter the land of their parents, wandering for 40 years, all the battles on the east side of the Jordan, crossing the Jordan River. That took forever, didn't it? And then now they're finally here, and they're ready for action. They're ready to do something, and they march around the city once and then go to bed. and you think it's hard sometimes, isn't it, to wait for God's timing on things. That God knows exactly how it should go and exactly when to take those obstacles out of our way or how to do it, and His way is always best. Zach?
This isn't an important question, but I'm just curious. I'm trying to get a visual. Like, how many people were marching around it, and how big was the city?
Yeah, so the city, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many people lived in Jericho, but it was one of the larger cities of Canaan. And so you're looking at, at least several thousand, if not several million people within this one city. And likewise,
they marching miles?
Miles, yeah, they would have marched miles around the city. And likewise, the people themselves, you're looking at several thousand to maybe even 2 million, conservative to liberal estimates of how many Israelites would have been marching around the city with the priest kind of there in front of them.
That's kind of a big deal.
I'm
just trying to picture like a movie in my head.
Yes, yeah. I like that, yeah. It's helpful to visualize it sometimes, and kind of gives you the drama of how difficult this task was.
It's really weird too.
Yeah. Right.
Millions of people go around your city.
Go around your city, yeah. And in a moment he'll discuss more how the people of Jericho felt about it. But yeah, it's not like going down to your local park and doing a lap. This is a big event, and even though they haven't battled anybody, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Now that you say that, and he said that, made me think of something. They didn't have no opposition. Were those people there at Jericho so scared of them, they wasn't doing nothing but walking?
Yes, sir.
And they didn't come out to attack them at all?
Yes, sir.
They were scared of them, wouldn't they?
Go back to chapter 5 and verse 1, and that's exactly what you're talking about. It says, "So it was when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan, all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan." They've already heard about the Red Sea, and we know that they're terrified because of that. That's what Rahab told us. They know that they're terrified because of that. They've heard about the 2 kings that Moses destroyed, and they're terrified about that. But this is fresh because they just crossed the Jordan River. It says, when they heard the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until they had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit. A spirit is the idea of what moves you to do something. They had no desire to stand up and act. They had no desire to get out of bed in the morning. They were so scared they couldn't, they were paralyzed in essence. No spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. And they are going to discuss that just a little bit more in a moment. But you're right. It's bizarre to think that this army marches around you and you don't even throw pebbles at them, something, get your big catapult out and shoot rocks at them. They don't do anything. They just feel it's not even worth it. There's nothing to try. Verse 12, it says, Joshua rose up early in the morning. That's his habit. He rises up early in the morning. And the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Then 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them. But the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the priest continued blowing the trumpets. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. And so they did this 6 days. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. And on that day they marched around the city 7 times. And the seventh time, there's a key word there. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's bringing up this one word over and over again. The seventh time it happened, when the priest blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Now, I do believe that they literally walked around the city 7 times that day. I think that is a true fact because he states it like it's a true fact. But I also know that when you are reading ancient Hebrew literature, they don't include numbers without significance. They think of numbers as ideas and not just math terms. They think of numbers as representing something. And so, especially if they're going to repeat the number 7, what was that, 4 or 5 times within that one or two verses there? If they're going to repeat the number 7 so many times, what are they trying to convey? What does the number 7 represent to a Hebrew people like this?
Completion.
That's right. It's completion, and in particular, 7 has the idea of divine will, of God's timing or God's fullness, that God has determined how long this should go on. God has determined how long they should march around the city. And so if they've done it these 7 times on this day, then they have done it according to God's will. And again, that goes back to the idea that our obstacles don't fall until God's determined. It reminds me of what Paul said in at the end of 1st or 2nd Corinthians, when he says that he had a thorn in his flesh, and he prayed to God 3 times to take it away. Now, 3 is also significant. What's the significance about the number 3?
Deity.
It makes you think of deity because it's the strongest number, and so to pray for something 3 times is in Paul's mind to give it all you got. And I'm not saying he probably didn't pray about it again later, but it's sort of representative of giving it all you got. You know, he's really, to pray for it 3 times is to say, I'm really concerned about this, God. I really, really want you to do something about this. 3 times he prayed for God to take it away, and God says, no, not yet. My grace is sufficient for you. If, in his infinite wisdom, he has seen that your soul, your spirit, your salvation, and the people around you are going to be greater benefited by you bearing this burden that you think about Jesus. He says, not my will, but yours. I don't want to bear this cup. I don't want to die on a cross. But your will be done, not mine. Paul says, I don't want this thorn in the flesh. But if you are using it to work out something good, I think Romans 8:28, I can bear it a little longer. Maybe they didn't want to, it doesn't say they didn't, but maybe they didn't want to walk around Jericho 7 times that day. Maybe they were tired, I don't know. Maybe they're just ready for it to be over.
Well, just walking in a line of millions of people,
Yeah.
one lap would be a long time.
Well, and they're prone to complain, aren't they, these people? So, you know, but you know, maybe they didn't want to, but they had to do it the right amount of times and trust God's timing because he knew what was needed. And so there's this kind of great emphasis here of waiting on God's timing, just kind of letting go of those burdens and knowing if you still bear that burden, God, while he may be, I'm not saying that he gave you the burden, I'm not saying that it's his fault that you have the burden. Burdens are often consequences of sin from other people, our own sins, or just the fact that Adam and Eve did sin, and so there's sickness and things in the world today. But if you are bearing a burden, even if God's not the one that gave it to you, he is the one that takes it and does something good with it. But it requires us to wait on his timing, on how that's best going to work out. And that's what they had to do with their great obstacle here in verses 15 and 16. And so he says, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now, before we move on, any thoughts or comments?
I was just going to
Yes,
mention,
ma'am.
and Steve said something to me back along with what Zach said. The size of the city had to be such that they were able to get around it
Sure.
within a day's time.
Multiple times.
Multiple times.
Yes.
And so could have been extremely huge because they wouldn't have been able to get around it. You
Yeah.
know? And then in thinking about the numbers of people, like Peggy said, if you had millions of people, it would take a longer time.
Well, and that is true, except we tend to think of space differently than they do. And that's, you know, you think about a city with millions, right? So, you know, New York City probably has millions of people. But and even they feel crammed in New York City. But ancient people would consider an average New York apartment very spacious. And we take up a lot of space today, and ancient peoples had little homes, especially in big cities, unless you were very wealthy, which most people were not. They didn't have, and she lived on the wall. Rahab lived on the wall. They would have crammed lots of people in those walls, and so. And I'm not saying that there were millions, and of course, the Bible doesn't tell us how many people, to my knowledge, were in Jericho, and so of course, scholars are just sort of doing sort of educated guesses or what have you in order to say how many. It may not have been millions, but I think it could have been possibly, just because those cities were compact generally, and they often. The way that it would work normally is someone would come to this area and begin to build a town, and as more people came and accumulated, they'd build a wall around it, and then more people would live outside of the wall. The wall, they didn't have just unending resources to build walls that would go, forever and ever and ever. And so when there was times of war, they talk about several times, they closed the gates and wouldn't open them back up. If you lived outside the city, you went into the city during times of war. And so you think the populace, a big chunk of them may be rural. That's how we would think of it. They don't live in the city limits and the wall limits, but they come to the wall and stay with a neighbor or something, and kind of cram into Jericho for the security of the wall at that time. And so you could have been looking at a lot of people in a relatively small space for that temporary time while they're waiting out this and hoping that they survive it and go back home. Yes, ma'am. That's a good thought.
I think this is a good reminder to us that when things are going well for us, for the church, and I realize this wasn't the church, these were God's people.
Sure.
That's Satan's prime time.
Oh, yes.
To get to work.
Yes, ma'am.
Because it didn't take long after the walls fell down for the children to sin.
That's right.
When you think about a first century church, when things were going so well, what's the first thing that happened?
Mm-hmm. And Ananias and Sapphira right away. That's right.
It's like things are going well. You better look around and make sure that you stay on top of things, because the devil's going to be working really hard.
Yes.
Just like you can hear for these people.
I really appreciate that. She's talking about how when things are going really well for yourself personally, or for the church or whatever, that is when Satan tends to slip in unnoticed. And she referenced Ananias and Sapphira, and it's interesting because when God created the world and put Adam and Eve in after the fall, and you have the first family, the very first problem that we know of was with their offering to God. And then in the New Testament, when you have God creating the family of God, the church, the very first problem that we're told about is about offerings to God. There's something about what we give to God that we really struggle with sometimes, isn't there? And that's what those first conflicts and what a lot of conflicts are about. And that is prime time for Satan to kind of slip in. It reminds me of in 2 Chronicles, I can't remember off the top of my head which king it is, but it's one of the good kings. And I actually think it was David. It was. In 1 Chronicles, it was David. And it says, now at that time, Satan stood up against the nation of Israel. David's life was going really well. And Satan stands up and says, let's see what stumbling blocks we can put in his way. And he stumbled over it. That's the occasion that David took the census. And then there was the great plague that killed a lot of people. And so Satan looks for those moments when you feel confident and sure, not in God, but success sometimes makes us lose track of where that success came from. And we begin to feel confident and sure in ourselves. And he's just there like the little guy on your shoulder, and there's no one there. But, like that, who is saying, man, aren't you good? Didn't you do a good job? Aren't you faithful? Aren't you so righteous? Aren't you so holy? And so you sort of slip into this state of, I can do this. And that's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12, I think. He says, let any man who thinks he stands, and that's stand on his own, take heed lest he fall. Proverbs, he says it this way, pride comes before a fall. And so I think that's a really good point. She's thinking ahead about chapter 7 with Ai and Achan, and how it was just a day later, or when they're taking all this treasure, or dealing with all these things, that he sins and takes a treasure he's not supposed to take. When things are going good, that's when we tend to stumble sometimes. So all right, let's finish up this chapter then. So verse 16 says, they shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now verse 17, the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Now God is a God who remembers every person and keeps every promise. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who were with her in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you by all means abstain from, now this is what gets Achan. You by all means abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things. Accursed things is reference to idols. And make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. All right, what we offer to God. And so the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, and then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And Joshua had said to the two men who had spied out the country, go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. And so they brought out all the relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. I love those times when it says to this day. There's a little clue there about when this book was written, because of course she's not still there. And so it was written within Rahab's lifetime. Verse 26, then Joshua charged them at that time, saying, cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds the city Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates. And so the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country. Now, very briefly here, a couple of thoughts. First of all, verse 21, I think, is sometimes a very challenging verse for people, because it seems very cruel for them not to just kill the men, but to also kill the women. And Miss Tammy, I just remembered you had your hand up. Just one moment, I'll come back to you. If you remember what you were going to say, so I'm so sorry about that. But they killed the women and the children, and it says the young and the old. And so, that for sometimes is very challenging for people to comprehend. And how can God require the death of innocent people in this way? But I want us to notice two things that we can see about God just from this very chapter. And the first one is, God is always willing to forgive people. And we know that because Rahab's household was saved, including the children and the women and all the people in Rahab's household. And so first of all, we see that all the people of Jericho could have been saved, and none of them had to die, if, like Rahab, they had repented and chosen to get rid of what he calls the accursed things, to get rid of their idols and worship God. That's clearly what Rahab did. But what that also tells us about God is this, that when you think about why did the other people die, why did those children and those women die, it's because of the leadership of the men who died there. And that is the truth, isn't it? That when men, or I mean really anyone, but you think about the head of the household, when the head of the household doesn't lead his household in the way that he should go, do not generations feel the effects of that? Do not people, the most obvious example of this, and there's lots of examples, but the most obvious example that I can think of is when families are, when especially you think the father gets consumed with alcohol. And I know that many of us have personal experience with our families suffering from that for generations, don't you see people struggle with that same problem? That's, we read about it in Exodus. God said, I visit the iniquities of the father upon the children to the third and fourth generation. That doesn't mean that God is kind of gleefully punishing the children for what the dad did. In fact, it can't mean that, because in the book of Ezekiel, he says, I don't punish the son for the father's sin, nor vice versa. That's really just sort of a Bible way of saying that when a man sins, his children will feel the effects of that. His grandchildren will feel the effects of that. His great-grandchildren. Your sins affect those who come from you for generations down the line. And so why is it that these people died? Because their fathers didn't lead them in the right way. And you think about it, if God had said, kill all the men, but don't kill the children, what's going to happen to those children?
No one to lead them.
no one to feed them, no one to care for them, no one to even if he'd left the wives, they this mass amount of women and children, they had no means really to care for themselves, especially in their time period. But when children die before they reach the age of accountability, what happens to them? They're with God for eternity. And so you have here God in his mercy is saying these children will be safe for eternity, even though their parents did not lead them in the way that they should go. And of course, it would have been so much better for them. This is not an improvement on if their parents had done the right thing and if they had lived lives. We were intended to live here on earth for a healthy lifetime. That's not an improvement by any means, but it's God taking something terrible and working something good from it. Those people who were old enough to make the choice for themselves, they died there in Jericho because of their choices. And their children went on to live in eternity with God. He protected them despite their parents' choices because they weren't old enough to make that choice. And I think what it really speaks to is the importance of us as men and women leading our homes in a way that protects the future generations. Because just as sin impacts for generations to come, you think about many examples in the Bible of righteousness impacting generations to come, even more so than sin oftentimes. And so that such an importance that we think about the future when we make our daily decisions. Miss Tammy, did you know what you were wanting to say? That's okay. We can go back for just a moment. Oh, yes, ma'am.
It says that Jericho measured less than half a mile in circumference.
Okay.
And that it was only about 7 acres.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's true.
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you how many people you can fit in 7 acres. They could cram a lot of people into a small space. And that's, they have done a lot of digs at Jericho, and they have found what they believe to be this level of dirt. And there even is one portion of the wall that didn't fall, which is very curious when you think about it. How did God save Rahab? I can't tell you for certain, but maybe there's one portion of the wall that didn't fall down. It's very curious to look at. Look it up on the internet sometime. But Sarah, were you going to say something?
Also, him saying kill the children meant that the revenge cycle
Yes.
would be cut
That's
off.
true. There is a protection for the people of Israel as far as going forward from revenge, but more importantly from idolatry. That they took care of it that way. That's right. And that's God only destroys nations when their sin has reached a certain point, and that we see that in the book of Genesis a lot. Sodom and Gomorrah. He tells Abraham that about these people, but he says it won't happen for 400 years. And that's God is very patient, and he waits 400 plus years sometimes for nations to repent, and when it reaches a certain point, only the children, in essence, spiritually survive that, because there's no turning back, in essence. And they were terrified. They knew they were all going to die. They didn't change. This is a hard-hearted people, scared but hard-hearted. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? If not, I'll let Johnny come up here. Thank you for your comments and your attention tonight.